You're listening to the Tony Kinnett Cast on 93 WYPC.
WCYTV
Here on the Daily Signal.
A wonderful Good Friday to you, the day that many of my fellow Christians celebrate the sacrifice made on behalf of all of us, the payment of our sins. A fantastic day for reflection. Then, of course, Easter coming up on Sunday and then into Monday. Because of that, on Monday, we will not have a Tony Kinnett cast here. There are a couple of the radio syndication stations bringing in a couple of guest hosts. I'm really thankful that they can do that. And that brings us over to the start of the quick news roundup, because I judge that, man, the judges are getting way too active. They kind of have to, because we're seeing lawsuits fly in hot and heavy. We're talking rush hour at Popeyes style orders flying in. And they're coming in basically as the Trump administration is cutting through the bureaucracy. Federal agencies which have had tons and tons of power for far too long. And when I mean tons and tons of power for far too long, I mean the constitutional framework created by the founding fathers to set up the United States federal government was meant to have three branches. These three branches were supposed to be the legislative, who makes the laws and holds trials for the executive. You have the executive, who is supposed to enforce the laws and essentially hold to prosecute the confirmations of the legislature. So you're not only prosecuting out the laws, but you're also carrying out the appointment confirmations made by the legislature. And last but certainly not least, you're supposed to have the judicial. The judicial is supposed to A, interpret the Constitution, and B, is supposed to weigh in on certain executive and congressional measures. Now, the executive branch had a couple of staff, because as any good officer knows, you need a guy to help you keep things, in practice. That's what the adjutant is for. And as the certain organization gets bigger, then that guy needs a couple of people under him. And then you need to look over more land with more people. And you need a larger organization to administrate the prosecution of certain duties. And Woodrow Wilson, looking at how Imperial Germany did this kind of stuff, decided, what if we took the United States federal government under the executive agencies, those three-letter agencies we all know and despise, what if we multiplied them by about 30? And then during the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration, what if we increased the number of agencies and then multiplied those by 30? And then, after the Second World War ended, the United States, in the middle of the Cold War, decided that maybe it was a little easier for congressmen and women to focus on re-election campaigns and fighting big, huge battles on this really cool, crazy new thing called televised politics. And we'll just let the agencies make regulations instead of laws. Well, instead of laws, we'll have rules and regs, and those will kind of govern the United States. And it turns out that people who aren't elected, that are hired to positions and stay there forever and ever and ever, amen, do a really, really, really awful job, because unelected bureaucrats have no accountability. And in that process, in that myriad spaghetti bowl of festering, horrific policy, totally against the original vision of the Constitution, became a series of protections for federal employees. Originally, all federal employees, period, all the way up to cabinet officials, even if they were appointed by or confirmed by the Senate, were instantly and without cause fireable at any given time by the President of the United States. The President is the boss of the executive branch. And if at any time the President is not a fan of how you are carrying out your job, then the President can snap his fingers and say, "You're fired," which the current President has a little bit of a history and experience in saying. The problem is that, we went through this weird union craze where not only were the guys working in the coal mines and those working on the auto manufacturing lines, not only did they get unions, but also people who didn't need unions got unions. Oh, the post office needs unions because, well, what if they're asked to deliver in the snow and the rain? Horrible. And teachers, you got to have teachers unions because, if we don't have teachers unions, then they're going to pay teachers 2 wooden nickels and the students are all going to be illiterate. I'm just kidding. Teachers unions don't care whether or not students are illiterate. And that eventually got up to the federal agencies. So you have all of these unions and tenured positions and appointed specialty positions that are not actually swapped out under a new administration. And then you just have this unelected group, unfireable group of federal employees who do whatever they want with no accountability, with a basically unlimited budget. And we've seen over the last couple of months of the Trump administration, what Republicans had long suspected was in fact true. There are massive amounts of waste, fraud, and abuse. And the left has responded, well, you just don't like some of the spending. You don't like the, just what it's spent on. Correct. I don't think that American taxpayer dollars should be spent on transgender comic books in Peru, Sesame Street in Iraq, spreading atheism in Nepal, going after Catholics or Protestants from the IRS or the FBI or the broader DHS, and the other nonsensical things that the federal government has been wont to do, like the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms shuttling guns down to Mexican cartels. I don't think the federal government should be doing that. And if the president of the United States runs on a reform campaign and comes in and says, all right, you guys, you're out of here. You're gone. We don't need you. Bye. Then he should be able to do that. But that wasn't how this ended up working out, because the federal government has spawned for itself all of these different scheduled employees. And so finally, President Donald Trump posted today, following my day one executive order, the Office of Personnel Management will now be issuing new civil service regulations for career government employees. Career government employees means they're here and they ain't ever leaving. He says, moving forward, career government employees working on policy matters, in essence, they have an impact on your life. They can tell you what to do and what not to do. These will be classified as schedule policy/career and will be held to the highest standards of conduct and performance. Correct. Because if you're working at the administrative level of the DMV and you set forward a stupid policy that impacts people based on race, based on sex, based on religion, based on the region of the country that they're in a way that's discriminatory, then you should be canned. If you're an individual who doesn't allow your team to give certain federal emergency management assistance to hurricane survivors because they have a Trump sign in the yard, you should be canned immediately, no questions asked. You shouldn't need a 3-tier ultimate super wedding cake process to fire bureaucrats. They're not special. In fact, they should be under more scrutiny because I'm paying for them. You're paying for them. And you're going to see all kinds of lawsuits over this. It's a major shift. This does, in fact, bring the Trump administration forward into a place where he begins shuttering the eternal bureaucracy. And to be clear, it's not going to be an effective permanent solution until Congress codifies this into law. Every executive order that is brought forward is useless unless Congress codifies it into law, because then the next president can come in and just flick a switch, or at least that's how it's supposed to be. Now we have federal courts that are jumping in and are ruling against random Trump decisions because they said, well, Biden said the other thing. A federal judge ruled today that the Trump administration's policy eliminating the non-binary option for passport holders is likely an equal protection violation. Again, this is just some district court judge. It's not an actual, appellate court ruling. And as funny as this is, only 6 of the plaintiffs who filed the lawsuit in this, what was almost a class action lawsuit, only 6 of them were granted some kind of an exception. And what did the judge, decide? Well, I think that, sure, this executive order was made, but, it kind of has something to do with some equal protection stuff. That's not how judicial interpretation works. If it's an executive order, then it's not binding past that president's prosecution. After that president's done prosecuting, whether you're Joe Biden and you're out to pasture quite literally, or you're, Barack Obama and you sit there and gripe in the corners for the rest of your life, you're not in charge anymore. You're done. And of course, we'll talk a little bit more about the Supreme Court having to weigh in. And I should point out the Supreme Court is already tired of dealing with this. And you can tell because of which justices are starting to reply to emergency requests and orders. Emergency requests and demands that they don't like the executive branch doing what Article 2 of the Constitution says the executive branch should do. Those complaints are even starting to annoy liberal justices like Justice Kagan, who denied an emergency request from 4 people in the U.S. illegally who were set to be deported. So they lost before the Board of Immigration Appeals, and then the Ninth Circuit affirmed that decision. And they asserted, oh, we're going to be victims of cartel violence if you don't help us out immediately. If you send us back to our home country, the cartel will get us. And Justice Kagan, a very liberal justice, was like, no, the Supreme Court is going to have to deal with this sooner rather than later. We're going to talk about some of the rest of the public's reaction to Trump stuff in a second for the radio crew. We'll catch you in a minute. Going to continue on the live stream. It's the Tony Kinnett Cast. That brings us down to Chris Van Hollen and the Adventures of Maryland Man, who I was told there was no proof anywhere this guy was a member of MS-13. And the Department of Justice started showing the proof. And did Chris Van Hollen, the Democratic senator from Maryland, wait for some of this proof before he flew down to petition the release of this poor Maryland father and husband? Oh, it's amazing, wonderful, beautiful. Because the left's been waiting for the story of the poor one-armed woman with cancer who was going to be deported and sent to, deported to hell. Like that was going to be the plan. And they jumped the gun with Kilmar. And how did this end up turning out? Well, Chris Van Hollen goes down to the beautiful El Salvador and he says, show me the man. And they're like, no. And so then, and I do enjoy this, he says, show me the man, and they sit him down at this table, and they talk, and there are these photos of what look like margaritas while they're chatting, and a couple of interesting observations are made. So first of all, people point out that it's a little gross that this guy flew down there to sit there and chill and have a pleasant chat and maybe have an alcoholic drink or two, which I thought this guy was in some kind of a concentration camp or something. And President Bukele of El Salvador pointed this out and said, so much for the whole death camp rumors that have been going around. And there's a little bit of controversy over, these margaritas on the table being staged. There's accusations being thrown out from an anonymous source that, oh, this wasn't real. And, Van Hollen's come out and said the same thing. And we'll play that clip a little bit later on the show. But the worst part of this for the Democrats is it turns out that if you zoom in on some of these photos, you'll see some weird tattoos on the guy's fingers. It's a marijuana leaf, a smiley face, a cross that doesn't look like a normal cross, and then a 3-dotted skull. For those of you who have ever done any kind of gang report research, this is it's a lovely routine. A lovely routine with those over in the gang side of things who... Well, the M on the marijuana leaf, that stands for M. The smiley face, that stands for S. The T, which has the disconnected crossbar of the cross, that's a 1. And then the 3-dotted skull, that's 3. MS-1-3. And this isn't conspiracy theory stuff. This is in like half of the inmates that are like MS-13 guys. Like the coy kind of representation in order to basically do like an acronym for your affiliation is the thing you say, well, I mean, you're kind of reading into it a little bit. Isn't that a little bit weird? Oh, it gets better than that, boys and girls. Because as Andy No, a friend of the show, been on a couple of times, has pointed out, Abrego Garcia's wife, in her little, oh, my husband is gone, I miss him so much video, she censored out his knuckles in his hand very overtly. So she put like 2 heart emojis, one over the other, over his knuckles so you can't see the MS-13 affiliation. Whoops. By the way, she also couldn't answer today about the protective order that she wrote on this guy. And it's very disturbing stuff. She's like, oh, wait, I called him violent. Hold on a second here.
I have to ask it. You did take out a temporary order of protection against your husband in 2021. Were you in fear of your husband?
Can't answer.
Husband is alive. That's all I can say.
Oh my. And by the way, even if she can't say it, we sure can, because we actually have that particular protection order. We're going to have to be real quick here because Josh Hammer, that interview, we've got to get to it. She accused this man and said that she had photographic and video evidence that he beat the crap out of her, pseudo-raped her, like stripped her clothes off of her, threw her into corners, basically threatened the life of her child in the backseat of the car, driving recklessly, and a whole list of other stuff. And the Democrats have made this their main dude. And you're going to wonder why the approval ratings for some of Trump's policies ain't slipping. We're going to talk to Josh Hammer over from Newsweek about that in just a second. Don't go anywhere. It's the Tony Kinnett Cast here on the Daily Signal.
The Tony Kinnett Cast on 93 WIPC.
Welcome back to the Tony Kinnett Cast here on the Daily Signal, nationally syndicated, first on 93 WIBC. Anytime we get to bring on Josh Hammer over, he's the senior editor at large at Newsweek, senior counsel over at the Article 3 Project. Dude's phenomenal. A broadcasting, legal mind, the sass that he brings to common sense issues are second to none. So we brought him on to talk about something that I'm constantly told the walls are closing in. Or whether it's tariffs, whether it is immigration policy, whether it was when he was running for president, whether it was when he was running for president again, the walls are always closing in. And then we find out they're not. Josh, thanks for joining us, man.
Tony, I really appreciate that very generous introduction. It's always great to join you, my friend.
Well, let's dig right into the good stuff, all right? You know, enough about the introductions and all of that nonsense. Let's talk about the ratings, the approval ratings, the hard numbers that are constantly not plummeting to zero like I'm told they are. I was told tariffs were going to drop things down to 2% approval for Trump, and it was going to be Black Monday, and we were all going to die.
Yeah, funny how that doesn't happen. I mean, as you said, I mean, every few months, maybe every few days, frankly, depending on the news cycle, we're told that the walls, as you said, are closing in on Donald Trump, and the walls just never seem to close in on Teflon Don because the guy has more lives than a cat, frankly. The tariff issue and his outspokenness against the so-called Washington consensus, this post-Berlin Wall, post-1989 notion. And really, there's one quote that I use to encapsulate what is known as the Washington Consensus. It's this quote from Michael Boskin. He was a George H.W. Bush White House economic advisor. And this is the infamous quote where Boskin, the economist, says, "Computer chips, potato chips, what's the difference?" And this was a quote that was considered to be an ode, a paean to free trade by any means necessary, to free trade at any and all costs. But unfortunately, there have been very real costs of trade that is oftentimes labeled free trade, but is typically not particularly free trade. Funny how that works there. And Donald Trump, if you go back, Tony, to his 2016 campaign, this is one of the issues that he ran against. He ran very hard against the bipartisan consensus on the trade issue. He ran very hard against the bipartisan consensus in many ways on immigration, foreign policy. Those are the three issues. Those are literally the three issues that elected Donald Trump the first time back in 2016. Those issues in many ways were the bread and butter of his 2024 successful campaign as well. And he's doing it yet again there. So when it comes to the approval ratings, I'm not particularly surprised that his approval rating has only gone up actually since the Liberation Day announcement. He obviously has changed his game plan a little bit since then. He basically punted on a lot of these reciprocal tariffs for now. But most important, he is not only keeping them, he's escalated them on China. That's the key issue, Tony. I mean, China is the issue. It is an issue that Donald Trump has been very, very outspoken on for decades. I call him
he was like memed into hell and back for the China. I mean, that's literally been his shtick since, time immemorial.
Totally. I mean, and I call him a class traitor on this issue. That's the verbiage that I like to use because he comes from Donald Trump was born to a very wealthy man, Fred Trump. He made a lot of his own money too, of course, but he comes from a wealthy background, and he has always been an outspoken dissenter to his own class, to his own ultra millionaires, billionaires when it comes to the issue of China. Most of the billionaire Wall Street class has touted for literally decades, welcome China into the panoply of nations, into the Western fold when it comes to the economic order. We were promised.
They'll moderate. Come on. Everybody wants to moderate. George Bush said that everyone in the heart of every American yearns for freedom. and the world and everyone.
Exactly. That's when Bush's second inaugural address, the so-called Freedom Agenda, which I am always quick to criticize. But it was this notion, this platitude that economic liberalization would lead to political liberalization. But all we've done is give our arch geopolitical foe the rope with which to hang ourselves. This is an out-of-control rogue superpower that is sending out legitimate spyware in the form of TikTok across our phones. They are launching spy balloons across the North American continent. They are our adversary in every geopolitical conflict hot zone across the world. Someone had to take them on, Tony. And Donald Trump is the first president since Nixon visited Mao Zedong back in the 1970s to finally take on China. And I, for one, am totally here for it.
So let's flip this in a little more. We're talking about that D.C. constituency. I was asked a couple of days ago, as a guy from Indiana, outside the Beltway, and of course, I know you are in the beautiful Sunshine State. You're also outside of that Beltway. What we get a good glimpse into, I'd say more times than not, is what is the focus of DC? Because while you're inside the Beltway, it's kind of difficult. It feels like everything is moving in different directions. But then you step back outside of, again, that lovely rundown capital of the country and see kind of what everyone's actually focused on. And I think that the idol that has been set up in DC isn't the left. It's not the right. It's this obsession, this almost fetishization of status quoism, like this idea that you don't rock the boat, you don't change anything, you just kind of keep things going the way they are since the fall of the Soviet Union, because you really need to, like, it's not broken. You know, no one looks around DC and goes, this is broken. They ignore the Rust Belt, you know, they ignore the Deep South, they ignore the Great Plains states. They just kind of close their eyes and say it's working. And that's what Donald Trump, I believe, ran to break. And it's one of the reasons that there's just such angst on the left side of the aisle that they're not really suggesting they don't like what Donald Trump is saying. They just don't like how he said it, because the essence of it is rocking the boat.
Right. And every so often they let the cat out of the bag. I was actually watching this hilarious clip on The View, not words I say every day, by the way, watching this hilarious clip on The View. But I was watching this clip on The View, and Whoopi Goldberg, of all people, started actually applauding Donald Trump's intent to abolish.
Dude, we played this last night. I couldn't believe it, man.
Believe it.
And so this is during the bonus tonus section. For those who are on the radio side of things, you didn't get to hear it. It's incredible. When I was told about this clip, because you tweeted about it, we've seen people tweet, yeah. I thought, oh, well, she just accidentally said that she was in favor of the ideas. No, it was a full-scale endorsement.
It was a full-scale endorsement. She was making the exact arguments that someone like you or myself would make, which is that this is up to the parents. I mean, let's localize this issue. It was really incredible. But it says a lot about the point that you were just making, Tony, which is that Donald Trump's agenda, I mean, look at his coalition. You have people like RFK Jr. I mean, the guy's a Kennedy. I mean, he comes from the most iconic Democratic family over the past century of American politics. Tulsi Gabbard ran for president as a Democrat literally last cycle in 2020 there. You know, this was not a typical right-wing versus left-wing election. This was essentially an election of a coalition of the common sense versus a coalition of the out of touch. That really is what this was there. And the trade issue, the issue of China in particular, really does factor into this there. I think the median American understands that China has ripped off Americans in every which way. They have a lot of American blood on their hands, by the way, not in active military conflict necessarily, but definitely when it comes to fentanyl overdoses. China is the number one country most responsible for the mass fentanyl crisis in America over the last decade, something I know about all too well as someone whose cousin tragically overdosed and died 8 years ago now. So China has had a lot of blood on their hands from that. They have the spyware, as I mentioned there. They are stealing intellectual property, trade secrets, and then they're subsidizing them illegally, repackaging them. All of this in violation, by the way, of the rules of the World Trade Organization that they nominally joined back in 2001. And so this is a rogue, illegally acting, authoritarian communist state. And again, elites have said that all will be fine. Just suck it up. You'll get a big market for your exports. You'll get lower prices at the Walmart or on Amazon.com, whatever there. And I fundamentally ask, as Donald Trump asks, is it worth it? Is it actually worth it at a certain point? Most Americans say no. Donald Trump says no as well. That's for sure.
It's just bewildering to me. And I've had this conversation with, by the way, a lot of our colleagues who are more free market absolutists and who are also more hawkish when it comes to foreign policy in the Middle East or in Asia. And this is where a very severe disconnect has started to really grate against me, where again, when you had Thomas Jefferson in office, all the way up through, you could talk about whether it was Rutherford B. Hayes or even later on through Coolidge, where there were presidents in this country who understood that economic international policy is fundamentally something to be used as a negotiation or a strong arm tactic of the United States as much as its military. And when I'm looking at China right now, it's, we want to station, the more war hawkish members of the Republican Party. Like, we need to beef up Taiwan and, put our boats right next to China and give them a big middle finger. But then when it comes to not taking literal slave labor produced goods, where there are guards with guns keeping people inside the Apple factory building, or the Uyghurs out in eastern China, I'm not really hearing much of a peep when it comes to what these tariffs actually are worth in terms of cutting us off from the proliferation of slave labor.
Yeah, very, very well said. And I'm happy you mentioned Taiwan as well, because I wanted to make an additional point when it comes to the issue of Taiwan. I think it's worth noting that, again, far from being a politically liberalized country due to economic liberalization, China has become only more authoritarian, only more militant when it comes to the East China Sea with the Philippines, the Japanese, South China Sea, in the Himalayan mountains on the border with India, and perhaps most compellingly on the issue of Taiwan. And it really does seem like the People's Liberation Army in Beijing is gearing up for a military invasion at this point of Taiwan. And the big question from an American perspective is, are we actually going to risk going to war with the other superpower to defend Taiwan? And I don't necessarily want to get into that whole conversation, but here's what I will say, Tony.
Yeah.
I will say that the fact that we're having that conversation already behind the scenes, and I fear that increasingly it's going to bubble up, is primarily due to one issue, which is the fact that Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, which is obviously based in Taipei, Taiwan, makes the most advanced computer chips in the world. So to circle back on our conversation to what I said earlier about this George H.W. Bush economist, Michael Boskin, who famously said computer chips, potato chips, what's the difference? I'll tell you what the difference is. A massive calamitous war would not be fought over potato chips.
Correct.
But it actually, God forbid, could potentially be fought over the issue of computer chips. So that example I find to be very illustrative, because it just drives home the fallacy of this free market fundamentalist, laissez-faire, quote-unquote free trade, even if it's not free at all cost style of thinking.
And again, there's this idea of the status quo antebellisms that believe in a soft-handed, multi-decade incrementalism towards a better world, right? And there are some elements of that in the general progress of technology and the way that goods are manufactured cheaper and quicker, and the transport of those becomes easier, that there is true, but also there is this foolishness that comes with it. And the idea that mankind is incrementally going to become more moral and loving and kind, and everything's going to moderate out. It's this John Deweyan philosophy that was ridiculous in the 1920s, and it's ridiculous now. And it frustrates me because I haven't seen a shred of evidence suggesting that China is going to suddenly moderate, and we can make all of our natural defense capable materials and assistive to the military production and wartime production outside, and we can lay ourselves down to all of these choke points and just expect, everyone else will play nice with the United States because we're acting like good little cucks. We're getting down on our knees and letting everyone make money off of the American through import-export markets. And it sounds really nice because we package it with really comfy words. And then the Beltway is shocked when Middle America turns around during this tariff process and goes, screw China.
Yeah, look, you're based in Indiana, Tony. I'm based in Florida, but I spent a lot of time in the Rust Belt because I went to law school in Chicago. I'm from New York, so I've done the drive to and from Chicago, New York many times. So I've driven through, small town Indiana, Ohio, Western Pennsylvania, you name it there. Anyone who instinctually has spent time in these places, you get it because you literally see it. Anyone who spent multiple nights in the same hotel in Toledo, Ohio, which I've done, you've walked around the streets of decimated downtown Steubenville, Ohio, which I've done. You literally see it with your own eyes there. I think back to Ross Perot in the early 90s talking about this great sucking sound. He was talking about NAFTA and jobs to Mexico there. Slightly different context, but a similar idea here. And the key lesson when it comes to economics, and people say that people who support tariffs are like economic rubes, they're ignoramuses there. No, look, I studied economics in college. I worked in economic consulting. I went to University of Chicago for law school because it's the home of the law and economics movement. So I know a thing or two about the dismal science. But here's what I will say. when we're talking about what public policy ought to be, what statesmen ought to do here, we're not necessarily going to blindly trust the economists, because even if it's the most quote unquote efficient policy, which I concede most free market, laissez-faire, neoliberal free trade policies are, that is not the be all end all of political statecraft. That is not why governments are formed among men. Governments are formed to pursue the common good and to establish justice and secure our rights and so forth there. So there are genuine trade-offs here. And one such obvious trade-off is consumer surplus versus production and manufacturing and supply chain resilience. It's a genuine, real trade-off. It's a value judgment. It's a kind of value judgment that the American people elected Donald Trump to make, and he's actually making it, which is great.
I wish we had more time to dig into this. I'm over here looking up some of the statistics and some of the trade routes and what those particular things affect, kind of as they relate to various regions of the country, and who is more effective when you talk about trade with the EU or trade with China or trade through certain straits, for example. And we'll have to talk about this another time because the FCC clock is a bit of a pain. Josh Hammer over from Newsweek. Really appreciate the work you're doing, man. We'll have you back real soon.
Looking forward to it, Tony. Thank you.
We'll be back in a second. Don't go anywhere. It's the Tony Kinnett Cast.
This is the Tony Kinnett Cast on 93 WIBC.
This is a little new something that we have brought over to the show, little quick news reactions. We got the quick news roundup. We got a few quick news reactions because some stories are not necessarily worth oodles, canoodles, and toaster strudels of time, but if I don't get to laugh at David Hogg or Jasmine Crockett at least once an episode, it just ain't worth it. So we're going to start off David Hogg, the vice chair of the DNC, a man who looks like Ellen DeGeneres with brown hair, or if they cast the really, really sickly kid for Aragorn, I guess. He's changing the hairstyle up a bit. He was elected to the vice chair of the DNC, which was seen universally as a really bad move. And he made a lot of news recently because he decided, man, we have all these older Democrats who've spent their entire lives backstabbing other members of the Democratic Party. And so this new class of Democrats in the Democratic Party are now backstabbing the older Democrats who weren't doing the backstabbing. So Hogg has been at the center of this because he's openly come out and said, yeah, we're going to spend like $20 million digging out these old Democrat opponents in districts, which I love it. So Hogg went on media today to do a little bit of PR. Who knows who told him to do this? And he starts ranting against democracy of all things. Now, I was told democracy was supposed to be the bright and shining star, the tagline, the word you moan in moments of passion in the Democratic Party. And I guess apparently not. David Hogg, here you go.
For them, because we go out there as Democrats all the time and say democracy is the most important thing. We have to defend democracy. We fail to acknowledge that this generation, democracy is what put us through school shooter drills and school shootings. It's what's put us through the climate crisis and so much more. What we have to do is prove that democracy matters by standing up to the special interests that are killing the American dream and making our young people lose faith, not only in our party, but the future of this country. That is why we're doing this.
For you.
So to recap that, for those who maybe were, caught off guard by the insanity of the statement, he said that democracy is what brought us to Stoneman Douglas High School. Basically, democracy is what brought us the school shootings. Democracy is what brought us climate change. I'm trying to picture the video of like the woman like thinking, and there's like math symbols all around her head. Or from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. What's his name? Where he's doing he's like explaining the crazy conspiracy theory, like democracy. I am amazed. This is such a great tactic, such a great strategy. So instead of, again, the reason that Democrats have like clung to democracy as hard as they have is because democracy is considered like an American word over the last, since, again, through World War II. It was the height of America. It was the counter to communism after World War II. It was democracy. It was the voice of the people instead of this authoritarian dictatorships, either from Nazi Germany or from Soviet Russia, right? So Democrats have like nothing else in common with fellow Americans at this point on the left in messaging. They hate the Constitution. They hate individuals who are successful in any way, shape, or form. They think the country is a racist, terrible, bigoted place, but the one thing it has is democracy. And now David Hogg is walking in and going, that last one thread that we have that sort of kind of work with Americans, set it on fire. Amazing. Amazing. Just coming right out and saying it. This next one's from a guy that I do like a lot. His name's Xavier DeRusso over from PragerU. And he's pointed out a couple of key things that I've noticed in the last couple of days. We've had a couple of clips of people saying that what we really need right now are racial reparations, and we also need people to apologize, and he doesn't fly with that particular line.
If all white people should feel guilty for slavery, then all black people should feel guilty for committing 54% of the murders in America. And to be crystal clear, I'm not apologizing for anything that I didn't participate in, and neither should you.
He's correct. He's absolutely correct. No one should be apologizing for crimes that they didn't do, but if you want to play the identity politics game, if you want to say that historically, by the statistics, more black individuals have been the subject of redlining and lots of terrible racism, even when the numbers aren't there, you're going to say, well, people say they felt racism against in the last year. Then, okay, if we're going to play that game, then by all means, explain the crime statistics to us a little bit. By all means, tell us about the string of security cam footages that always seem to lean a certain way at pharmacies like Walgreens. Or we go status quo antebellum of the whole second Obama term, everything is due to your race conversation. We say it's because you have a character and a culture. And the character that you have and the culture that you participate in willingly means a lot more than the amount of melanin in your skin. One of those doesn't involve with someone losing in a rather embarrassing fashion. I would recommend a little bit of self-conscious there. So great work from Xavier. This next is really fantastic. So we've talked about Senator Van Hollen. We've talked about the wonderful little trip he took down to meet with MS-13 tattooed, wife-beating illegal immigrant Kilmar Abrego Garcia, or as AOC calls him, Kilmar Abrego Garcia from El Salvador. Goes down to meet with him and does actually get to meet with him. And apparently Bukele does slap a couple of margarita glasses down on the table, which everyone else says is really terrible skullduggery. I think it's funny. I do. Man takes a photo op trip and then is mad that the president of El Salvador plays into the photo op. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Anyway, Margarita Gate, as Senator Holland describes it. He comes out and it's a really, really funny clip. So here's Senator Van Hollen, Margarita Gate. We got to get to the right clip, though. Let me get it up here.
About what I would call Margarita Gate. I don't know if you guys have been following this, but President Bukele, after I met with Kilmar, did this tweet showing us at a table with these two glasses. So here's what happened. When I first sat down with Kilmar, we just had glasses of water on the table. I think maybe some coffee. And as we were talking, one of the government people came over and deposited two other glasses on the table with ice and I don't know if it was salt or sugar around the top, but
I love it. So he's spending this entire explanation, this entire whatever you want to call it, on the terrible scandal of the margarita glasses, when he hasn't quite figured out that the reason people are mad is because he went down to hang out with a guy that's got MS-13 tattooed all over his fingers. And the more Democrats lean into that, the worse it's going to get for them. And it is not going to get any prettier. We got to kick the radio crew over to commercial. Catch you guys in a second. It's the Tony Kinnett Cast. All right, folks, over on the live streams and podcast and such, Trump talked about it today. He was asked about it previously, yesterday, I believe. And Trump said, look, believe it or not, as a president, I've got things going on. Because Trump takes press questions every 15 minutes, there are in fact things that might slip from being in front of him. But whether or not Trump did know about Kilmar Abrego Garcia or not, or he was playing it down, or he had questions still, or whatever, he kind of stepped back from it a little bit. People thought, oh, this is because it's starting to turn against Republicans. No. Today, Trump came back and started reading the things the DOJ had released, like the footage from the Tennessee Highway Patrol, which they stopped Kilmar Abrego Garcia, and he was like really evasive and wouldn't answer whether or not he was trafficking individuals at the moment. And then the Biden DOJ ordered the Tennessee Highway Patrol to take his picture and let him go. Again, the other MS-13 judge rulings. MSNBC, I know that's a bit redundant. When they were covering this today, because I guess they thought Trump was just going to bumble it all up and mess it up. When Trump started to point out, hey, this guy is an MS-13 member, and there's all this evidence to support it, so the Democrats are throwing all their weight behind a domestic terrorist, or at least an international terrorist, according to the State Department. MS-13 decides, nope, cut the camera.
In 2019, Garcia was issued a deportation order. Two separate judges affirmed Garcia was a member of MS-13, which is a gang that may be even worse.
We've been watching President Donald Trump there swearing in the new administrator of the CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid.
I love it. That's fantastic. I mean, come on. How can they do that and think, oh yeah, no problem, that was smooth, no one noticed anything at all? Awesome. And then, oh boy, the optics are not good for the Democrats. And we've already played the footage of Harry Ensign over on CNN talking about the polling. Not good stuff. All right, one little bonus piece of news reaction here. The Canadian federal elections are coming up before the end of April. And, we've talked about Pierre Poilievre and things. There was an individual who asked about the pipelines and the status of the Keystone Pipeline, new pipelines from Alaska. They have to go through Canada to come to the United States. Carney, the liberal current prime minister who is running for the election to be selected by Parliament, he said that pipelines are not necessarily among any major projects that Canada would choose to prioritize. So as far as the Canadian federal elections are concerned, the transporting of fuel to the United States, which has always been kind of a bedrock of U.S. trade, Carney might be scaling that way back. And that's going to be a lot of contention in the news in the next couple of weeks, and it's why the Canadian federal elections are extremely important. We're going to be back in a second for a bit of mail time. It's the Tony Kinnett Cast here on The Daily Signal. Mail time. Mail time. Mail time.
On the Tony Kinnett Cast.
All right, let's do a little bit of mail time here. Let's talk about some of the things that you guys really want me to talk about. First question is from Timothy. He says, isn't due process for Kilmar Abrego Garcia important? Yes, it is. The problem is that a lot of people in this country have no idea what due process is. If you ask the average American what they think due process means, they think that it's the cop arresting you, reading you the Miranda rights, and then you have a right to a lawyer and your one phone call, and then you get your speedy trial, and the grand jury comes in, and you get a whole big thing. And for United States citizens, yes, that is in fact what you are entitled to if you are accused of a crime against the state or the federal government, or your Commonwealth, if you're from Pennsylvania or Kentucky or Virginia. But in the case of immigrants, legal immigrants, a large part of the due process for legal immigrants is carried out by the State Department. And you have immigration hearings, which are facilitated, and judicial reviews of the terms of their visa. For illegal immigrants, it depends. And here's what it depends on. Why are they, being held? Are they being held because they are suspected of committing crimes? Well, then you need to hold a judicial hearing for the individual to say, I have not committed these crimes, I should stay. And then the individual likely ends up being deported. You don't have to prove whether or not they committed the crime because they're not a U.S. citizen. You say, well, I really don't like that. Too bad. Too bad. The United States does not have the time. The founders understood this. This was a concern during the War of 1812. This was a concern during the Mexican-American War. The idea that you have a large number of aliens that might be present in U.S. jurisdiction that all get the big, huge grand jury, hullabaloo, whatever. No, it's not. A judicial hearing is all that's necessary. The Kilmar Abrego Garcia case had a 9-0 decision ruling from the Supreme Court for one reason and one reason alone, because the Trump administration made a mistake. What was the mistake? People think, it's a mistake that he was deported. No, that's not the mistake. The mistake is that there was not one final judicial hearing for Garcia to basically give him the chance to say, here's the proof I'm not a member of MS-13. What about innocent until proven guilty? Only for U.S. citizens. Because the punishment for an illegal immigrant in the United States is not imprisonment in the United States. The punishment for an illegal immigrant in the United States is to be kicked out of the United States. That's the whole point. Now, here's where the Supreme Court's ruling comes into play and what the Trump administration did and did not do. The Judge Zinnes ruled that the Trump administration needed to bring him back to the United States, which, no. He has no right to be in the United States. There's nothing in the U.S. Constitution or U.S. federal code or the district codes down in southern Texas along the border that state judicial hearings have to occur in the United States. We do judicial hearings everywhere. Embassies and consulates are set up with the stuff that allows individuals to have judicial hearings just about anywhere. So when the Supreme Court ruled that the Trump administration had to facilitate a judicial hearing for Abrego Garcia, they didn't say, there's nowhere in the ruling, I've read it 9-0 the entire time, there's nowhere in it that they say 9-0 he's got to be brought back to the United States. The phrase does not appear once. And by the way, it's why Judge Zinnes couldn't hold the Trump administration or any of its members in contempt, which, by the way, Zinnes doesn't have the authority to do because they're just a district court judge. They don't have the authority to hold members of the Trump administration in contempt who are just arguing on behalf of the Attorney General and the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Homeland Security. So when we're talking about due process, did the Trump administration make a mistake? Yep, absolutely. Was due process provided? Kinda. You can make the argument that there are 2 times that an immigration court ruled that this individual was a member of MS-13. Now, the Supreme Court did rule, though, that he needs one more. He needs one more because before he is deported, where? To a prison, you have to go through the judicial review, or before you return him to his home country, because the dude's from El Salvador. He's a citizen of El Salvador. So when he came into the United States, he said the same thing that every single asylum seeker says. Everyone, whether they're lying or they're telling the truth. I fear to go back to my country. I fear for my life. Oh no. Now, because that's the answer everyone gives, doesn't mean it's always true. So the onus is on the person seeking asylum to prove why they are here and what the threat is. Now, again, the Tennessee Highway Authority, the Tennessee Highway Patrol, saw the guy and thought, I don't like this. We're going to hold him because we need some answers as to whether his asylum claim is valid. The Biden administration forced the Tennessee Highway Patrol to let him go. So what does this mean? What does this mean for the Trump administration? What does this mean for due process? The people complaining about like a constitutional crisis, and first they came for the trade unions, and then they came for the communists, and then they came for me, and there was no one left. Oh, no. That's not what this is. People who are telling you that are being ridiculous and are being illiterate. your inability to read a Supreme Court decision or to know what due process is on you. If you're an adult who doesn't understand civics, well, I don't know how to help you other than letting you know that, yeah, there's a lot of places on earth where you can find resources about how the U.S. legal system works. Now, because this particular individual does in fact get a judicial hearing, the United States can kindly ask El Salvador, hey, would you release the dude long enough for us to have a judicial hearing for him? And then you can have him. Or maybe he's sent somewhere else. That's the really sticky side. Really, if Garcia would have been sent anywhere else except El Salvador, this likely wouldn't have been an issue. But he's a citizen of El Salvador who said, I'm terrified to go back here. They're going to destroy me. Well, it's because El Salvador has him on record for capital crimes. The MS-13 tattoo, you know how Bukele feels about members of MS-13. You say, well, it's a really rough situation. Yeah, it's one of the reasons that this foreign policy needs to be hammered out. And I think that if the Trump administration dispatched 2 lawyers and an immigration officer down to El Salvador to the visiting room and brought him in, they can even bring out some margaritas and give him a chance for his say, presto, it's done. And the libs literally have nothing else to say about it. But I think that the current strategy at the moment is to let the left kind of go out on their skis and embarrass themselves over it as long as they can. I genuinely think that's what's going on. We'll be in touch on Tuesday. It's the Tony Kinnett Cast. Sorry, the ending radio clock crept up on me just a little bit there for the live stream folks. All right, I'm going to answer one more question over here on the mail time. And let's check. Make sure there's many questions. Producer Nick, keep your eye out for any mail questions in the comments, just for kicks and giggles. Just any that are out there. Many of you may not find this particular question interesting, but it was asked in earnest and then twice. So the last time I saw the comment was from a lady named Leah, at least I hope it's a lady named Leah, asked, who does the wardrobe for Top News in 10 and the Tony Kinnett Cast? Me. These are the same blazers that I've always had. Some of them I've had since college. Some of them were from Kohl's. Some of them are from like TJ Maxx or Marshalls or something like that. Some of them are from Goodwill, you know, the shirts. I don't do the whole like professional wardrobe thing. I genuinely appreciate that you think that I am in the big time enough or whatever, that I have someone who's running around getting custom tailored suits for me all the time. I appreciate that. But no, I'm broadcasting out of Indiana. And if I have a production team, I'd rather they be doing production stuff for the show. All right, we're going to head over to our interview with Dr. Isaiah Hankel for some whistleblowing reports about the National Institute of Health. The federal grant system is a complete mess over there. I think you guys are really going to enjoy it. And then we're going to be out of here for Easter weekend. It's the Tony Kinnett Cast here on The Daily Signal. Be back in just a sec.
If I could fall into the sky.
This is the Tony Kinnett Cast on 93 WIBC.
Welcome back to the Tony Kinnett Cast. It's great to be joined by Dr. Isaiah Hankel, over, of course, from Cheeky Scientist, and then I believe the CEO also of overqualified.com. Do I have that right?
You have it right. Great to be here. Thank you.
So you've got some whistleblowing stuff about the National Institutes of Health. Let's not, stand aside on any ceremony. Just break it down for us.
There's a lot of waste and outright fraud that happens at academic research institutions in particular.
Of course.
Many of which are NIH funded. And so, I think that the American public now is becoming aware of just how much fraud there is because of DOGE and other factors. And one of the biggest areas of fraud are when a grant gets approved. So an academic researcher gets a grant and it's approved for what that grant outlines. But what tends to happen is they use that money to work on whatever exploratory research that they want that wasn't approved. and many times that no American taxpayer would be okay with.
So I have a little bit of experience with this during my time getting my master's degrees. All of the education side, academia is a mess and a half. I mean, boy, if we started going into that one, we'd be here for a while. But let's talk a little bit about some of the grant approval process in general. A lot of people don't quite understand who checks up on a grant to see if once it's approved, how they're spending the money or whether or not the amount of money is appropriate. Walk us through how this works, because we hear about grants all the time and about money being given from the federal government and through organizations like the N.I.H. to people. But how does that work?
Yeah, I like that you think that they're getting checked up on at all.
I know they're not.
There's almost no oversight whatsoever, and that's part of the problem. Once the grant is approved, now of course the grant has to be approved, and so they have people in the field, review it. It gets scored. These prototypical R01 grants that you hear about a lot, between $1 to $2 million, they vary, but it's a large sum of money, are given to people who have absolutely no business experience, no financial experience, no personnel experience. And they very often don't know what they're doing. So a lot of them, including the principal investigator whose lab that I did my N.I.H. funded work in, would just blow through that money, right? It's supposed to last maybe 4 or 5 years. They blow through the money in a year or two because they don't know how to balance a budget at all. And then they need to get more grants, or they'll start working on something else. And what tends to happen, and the point that I think is really important here, is very often these researchers, they're the only ones that are close to the research. They know if a product is a dead end, but very often they can tell a compelling story with the data they have so far. They tell a compelling story with that data to get a grant approved that they already know is going to go nowhere. Then they use that money to the tune of millions of dollars, like for these R01 grants, to work on whatever else they want to work on.
And I want to be clear with this. You guys really do not understand how much there is a fluffing up of the academic language. Again, taking 18 pages to say 2 sentences worth of information that is then brokered into use to try to convince someone that your grant is worth all of this extra money, or you need just a little bit more in a continuing grant, or whatever it may be. And it's amazing to see someone take again, I've told this story a couple of times. When I was at Ball State University, there was a guy in our cohort who had a grant proposal that was going to study something related to putting condoms, prophylactics, on cow udders. By the way, not regarding udders that were infected, maybe that's like a kind of bandage that you would put on the udder to keep things there, like a medicine. No, not at all. That had nothing to do with what this study was about. But the way that he described it in the grant approval process made it sound like it had nothing to do at all with either of those things that he was planning on messing with, the weirdo, and it got approved. I mean, I'm amazed consistently at how fluffy a lot of these grants are. It's downright fraud. You're right.
And they do it on purpose, too, so that the average American taxpayer will have no idea what they're talking about. And they can claim, oh, you're just not intelligent enough. You don't really understand. So if somebody tries to call them out and be like, wait a second, you said you're going to use the grant for this, you used it for this. They're like, well, there's some crossover in fields. It's actually all biology because we were working on the udders, right, or whatever. That's part of the strategy. And what there needs to be is oversight. The example that I like to give is for trading firms, like stock trading firms. The SEC can go in at any time, just walk in the doors, look at whatever they want to look at. And of course, this provides pressure to where they have to keep the data clean, make sure they're doing things with best practices, or else. And that's a big or else, because they can walk in at any time without having to notify them. Now, if that was happening in academia, you would quickly see a lot of changes for the better. You'd see the grants being worked on that were supposed to be worked on. You'd see people only applying to grants if they knew they could follow through on something that actually would be translational, would actually help human health. If somebody could come in, walk in at any time to any lab, any university, let me see the data. Let me see what you worked on this past month, quarter, year. Are you actually working on what you're supposed to be working on? These people that you hired, what are they working on? None of this happens at all, not even close.
Exactly why I asked you what auditing process or what oversight process there was. And of course, we do need to talk about the complete absence of looking at the results of grant funding during the actual study itself, again, which there's no oversight. And anyone can write a study was null because something out of my hands happened during the study and everything was lost. Oh man,
that 2.3 million was just evaporated into thin air because, all of the rats mysteriously died in this study. That kind of stuff happens so frequently. You guys wouldn't believe it. But I don't think you just need an organization where you have oversight for academia. To a degree, I like that you mentioned the stock situation or trading situation. And I'm sure that I'll be getting a lot of axes thrown at my head for this. It's one thing to understand business, accounting, and finance. It's very hard to fudge around some of the numbers. We've been watching that for a long time. But academic fraud, in the way that we do it in the modern age, that's kind of a newer one. And I'm worried about an oversight committee at the congressional level or an oversight organization being set up and having people over it who don't know how to read academic articles and proposals, who are going to essentially have the kind of ancient framework or maybe the ancient analysis of the congressmen who bring people before into committees and don't understand what Facebook is. They think the internet is a series of tubes. I'm worried about that being suggested as a solution here on the oversight for academic grants.
I think the oversight can be similar to the peer review process. But if other organizations, including businesses, right, who are being strangled by regulations right now from people who very often have never run a small business, why should academia be immune to that? Why do they get to lack accountability whatsoever? And it can be as simple, at least to start, as going through the expenses. What was this? Where did this money go? They don't even track where the money goes. You can't even find out what they paid for. Why did you buy this antibody? Right? I mean, I don't think it's going to get down to that level, but if we could look at the largest expenses that a particular lab had, that is entirely reasonable. And to see where that money went and what was produced. Because like you said, and this is in my case, you can go look at my principal investigator's ORCID website and see, okay, here's the grant. I believe it was on cyclosporin or a similar protein. After that grant, no publications on that protein, but a bunch of publications on this different protein, GON4L, right? And then a grant on GON4L. So they get the grant, they know it's a dead end, they use all that money to explore something else to get another grant, then they use that grant to explore something else, and it was never approved. And that's how you get things like, condoms on cow udders.
Right. Plan B granting.
Paying for that.
It frustrates me to see, again, this kind of springboard, because grants are so easy to procure. There are such mechanisms for kind of the introduction to this long series of, like you said, cases of waste, fraud, and abuse. And this is one of the things that's frustrated me about the education side of things, because that's kind of where my original expertise lies. I'm frustrated by when you do try to go look through some of these systems, and I'm sure that your researchers and investigators are aware of this. Some of these websites are built like it's 2002, and they're these awful broken databases. You have to request special requests to get access to things. I'm of the opinion that every single grant proposal should be public knowledge in a public database with some personal identification-y things obscured, unless there's a FOIA request to them, perhaps. You don't want to list addresses maybe for some things, depending on the situation. But why are some of these things so hard to get to? I mean, there's the answer you and I know why it's hard to get to, but why can't this be reformed sooner rather than later? At least that side of it.
The universities, the researchers, these so-called intellectuals, they won't give an inch because they know what they're doing is wrong, and they don't want any oversight whatsoever. I don't want to get too theoretical here, but they believe that they are smarter than the average person. They believe it's their right. They're owed this taxpayer money. They don't believe.
Well, that's not from your mouth. That's from theirs. They've openly admitted this, that they believe they're in an above tier and above caste in society.
Yes. Exactly right. And so when they hear that the American taxpayers want accountability or somebody else does, they're like, get out of here, peasant, right? We get to decide what we use this money for. You owe us this money. They're forgetting and they're learning this lesson. They're being reminded today. And I think it's going to continue in terms of the reminders that they receive, because they'll need a lot of reminders that they work for us, the public, the people that pay taxes. They are public servants. They only get to do the research that we approve. And that's the lesson that needs to be learned here. And that's what's been forgotten.
So, of course, one of the cornerstones in the next century, I think, that is going to be, maybe not even, when I don't mean cornerstone I mean it in the more literal sense that one can put it in this metaphor. It is going to be foundational. the COVID-19 abysmal failure, and then the exposure of all of these practices, not just in how government policy was effectuated, not just in how local policy was brought into place and faulty science, but the grants that were awarded out like Halloween candy based on COVID research that could be anything and everything.
Yes.
I think that we're going to look back over the next century and talk about one of the greatest academia scandals and medicine scandals of all time. And it is going to be the research surrounding and to the secondary and tertiary associations with COVID-19. I think that your assertion in that article for the Daily Signal is spot on.
Yes, and I'm glad that it happened overall. It's tough to say that. I hope we see more and more accountability, like the scientist from Ecolab that was debarred. I hope we see more of that. There needs to be accountability because for the longest time, outright fraud could be found, retractions at the highest level, like what we saw with the Stanford research in terms of Alzheimer research that was retracted from Science magazine and others. They get a slap on the wrist in many cases. They're still allowed to continue research in many cases. They just go to a different university. There's no accountability whatsoever. And so we need to see that accountability and stop this from happening. And everything that's happened over the past 5 years has showed that, a lot of people have a hard time with government and they like to see, okay, this fraud waste is going away in government, but they don't realize that academia and especially these academic journals have propped it up because the government will point to, oh, this academic journal said so. Oh, follow the science. Oh, it was peer reviewed. There's still articles that were published, whether it's from Science magazine, Nature, Springer, that haven't been retracted, that are still promoting this wet lab theory. Think about that.
Right.
And they know that as soon as they retract those, right, it is going to create this cascade. They can hold it back as long as they want, but the people know now. The eyes are on it, and there's going to be changes.
I do have to refer to obviously a very classic example of investigative journalism. You mentioned, you said that you were glad that overall that the COVID-19 situation kind of developed as it did because it allowed what has been a festering boil shuttered away from society for a long time to be exposed. Yes. And it reminds me of Upton Sinclair, who later went on the record after his expose on the meat packing plants in Chicago. And, we talked about how obviously it was disgusting and it led to a lot of regulations that made a lot of food safer. But he was later on the record saying he was glad that the meat packing plants in Chicago had been allowed to operate as long as they had because their security got lax. They kind of dropped the ball on shuttering some of this stuff from the public, and it allowed Upton to slip in and capture a lot of this information. And I think that COVID-19 being the straw that broke the academics' back is, in fact, you can argue a justifiable good for society that we were actually able to see because they were so smug, so satisfied they'd shuttered this all away, and us mere mortal fools would never actually look into it. They got lazy, and it ended up creating a new call for accountability and for whistleblowing from the inside of the system.
They got more arrogant than you could possibly imagine, if you can imagine academics getting even more arrogant.
It's a little hard to imagine at that level.
Not one mask, two masks. Okay,
and the face shield,
and a face shield while you're walking outside by yourself. Just because they wanted control, right? These people don't believe in God. They believe they are God. And they believe that you should be euthanized if you don't bow to their intellectual superiority. That is not hyperbole. That is a fact. I've worked next to these people and many other doctors who have come out the other side and seen the changes, right, that have happened from COVID and how these people are outright against humanity, really, against certainly the common man, the common woman. So I think what we saw, the arrogance that we saw is the straw that broke these academic backs. I mean, think about what they said, what they did. They wanted people to get vaccines. They said the vaccines were 80%, right, in terms of efficacy. What are you talking about? 80%, right? And they still haven't apologized. There still has been very little accountability for this. So I think when people, as they get further and further away from these events that happened, they're not going to let it go. They're going to get more and more angry, and they're going to keep demanding accountability.
And that needs to happen. I mean, you do need, after there is an infection which is exposed, there needs to be a disinfectant applied. And that has to be applied universally. Dr. Isaiah Hankel, thank you so much for joining us. Of course, the article will be linked in the description. Really appreciate you making the time.
Thank you for having me on.
We'll be back in a second. Don't go anywhere. It's the Tony Kinnett Cast.